Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about how you can use your bishops really effectively in a game of chess. I want to cover 3 key areas of this, and if you stick through to the end, I'll also be going through a worked example of how you can use a bishop really effectively in your own games. We'll go through the process of creating a plan around a powerful bishop, and this should really help you to start winning more games and playing better online chess fast. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and do leave any comments or questions you might have down below. So the first rule concerning bishops that I want to cover in this video is bishops love open positions, and this makes a lot of sense when you think about what kind of piece they are. Bishops play down diagonals, of course, and so if the diagonals are blocked, especially if they're blocked by your own pawns, then it really limits the scope of bishops. On the other hand, knights work quite well around these blocked positions because knights can jump, and so this is a really key difference between the two minor pieces. So the game I've got on screen here was played between Magnus Carlsen and Boris Gelfand in 2014 at the Zurich Chess Challenge. And the reason I really like this game is because when we look at the position here, we can see that the material is equal, the centre is looking fairly blocked, there isn't too much going on in the position in terms of imbalances. Both kings are castled on the same side. Both players will be fighting for control of the c-file. Magnus does have the doubled pawns, but they're not necessarily game-changing weaknesses here. It's not going to be easy for Boris Gelfand to take advantage of that. So I think a lot of players here might simply play knight takes on e4, and after bishop takes, simply drop the rook into the c-file and start contesting here. And at this point the position is now dead equal. However, coming back to this position, that's not what Magnus plays. Instead, he comes up with a much more imaginative move, and the idea here is that he really wants to open up these powerful bishops on g2 and f4 so that they can start raking down the board and causing havoc in black's position. So the move that Magnus played is quite deep. If you want to pause the video and have a think about what it could be, then please do so. So here Magnus played pawn to g4. And I don't want to go too deep here on all the possible moves that black could play in response. Instead, we'll follow the game continuation. So Gelfand took this pawn on g4 with his bishop. Magnus then took the knight on e4. Gelfand took back with the pawn. Magnus dropped his knight into d2, attacking the pawn on e4. Gelfand defended with f5. And now the real point of Magnus's whole plan here, he plays pawn to f3. This is really the only move in the position that retains an advantage, and the whole idea, as mentioned before, is that he's looking to completely crank open the centre here so that he can then really attack powerfully with these bishops. Now Boris played e5 in response to this move by Magnus. If we just jump it back, if he had taken the pawn on f3, Magnus can now take with the knight, which is ready to hop into e5, and as said, we've massively opened the position for our bishops, which are now looking very, very powerful. Instead of doing this, Gelfand played pawn to e5, and in response, Magnus took that pawn. Now Gelfand took on f3, and now the knight jumped him. So we'll leave the position here, but I will drop a link for this game down below if you want to check it out on chessgames.com, a really good chess website for viewing historical games. But the key thing to take away from this position here is the importance of opening lines for your bishops, and because of this active play and the scope that Magnus created for his bishops, he did go on to outplay Gelfand and win a really nice victory in this game. The next rule concerning bishops is that they tend to beat out knights in endgame positions where you have pawns on both sides of the board, and really this builds on the theme that we just looked at around the fact that bishops do very well in open positions. So because bishops have the long range scope to look down diagonals, it means that they can very quickly move around the board and also cover both sides of the board from a long distance away. Conversely, knights can't do this. They only have a short range scope, and so to get over to another side of the board they have to jump over that way, which takes multiple moves, and then equally if they wanted to go back in the direction they came from, it's going to take more moves to get there, and they won't be able to cover the area of the board that they've just been in. This endgame here is a good demonstration of the power of the bishop in an endgame where you've got the pawns on both sides of the board. So here we can see that both players have a pawn on the 6th rank, 2 steps away from queening, and black even has an extra pawn with 3 versus 2 pawns. However, black is dead lost in this position because the white bishop on g8 is cutting the pawns from proceeding any further down the board, and the H pawn for white is simply going to march down to the queening square, and the knight can't get back in time to stop the pawn. So definitely an important rule to keep in mind if you're about to go into an endgame and there are pawns on both sides of the board. Have a look at your minor piece, have a look at your opponent's minor piece, and think about how that could play out in the endgame, especially if you have the opportunity to trade down in the middle game to a more favourable and winning endgame. And the final rule concerning bishops that I want to discuss in this video is activate your bad bishop. Now, I did do a video covering bad bishops. There should be a card coming up on screen now for you to follow that link and check the video out if you want to. I'll also drop a link to the video down in the description below. But for this video, I just want to focus on one of the key principles here around bad bishops, which is to activate your bad bishop. So here we can see that the white bishop on d5 is technically a bad bishop because its own pawns on c4 and e4 are blocking the center, and they're on the same color square complex as the bishop. As discussed in the bad bishops video, which I just mentioned, if your bishop is on the same color square as your central pawns, then it's considered a bad bishop. If, however, it's on the opposite color complex, then it's considered a good bishop because it's got more scope to work with, as we discussed in the first rule of this video. So here we can see that white technically has a bad bishop, however it's a very active bad bishop. Because white has managed to get this bishop outside of the pawn chain and anchor it on d5, it's now an absolute monster, looking in both directions and cutting the board in half for the black player. And in the final part of this video, I just want to talk about how white could formulate a plan here, working around this huge trump in the position that they've got through this active white bishop, and then also thinking about the other imbalances in the position and how white can use them to actually press home an advantage and claim the full point. And for this last part of the video, we're touching upon the importance of creating a plan and using the 5-step critical thinking technique, which I did cover in another video, again linked on screen now. So it's white to move here, and they need to find a plan to press home this advantage. What's so brilliant about this position from a learning point of view is that white has advantages on both sides of the board. So if we take a look at the imbalances for a moment, which is the first step in creating a plan, the first thing to note is that the material is even for both sides. So we can see that there's no imbalance there. The second imbalance of note is that white has the superior minor piece, the bishop on d5 versus black's quite passive bishop on c8. With regards to pawn structure, black has a backwards pawn on b6 which can be attacked by white, and white has a weak pawn on a3 which is isolated and undefended. With regards to space, we can see that white has a space advantage on the king side due to this advanced pawn on f5. And finally, when giving consideration to open files, we can see that there's an open d file, but that's currently blocked by the white bishop. And there's also a half open b file on which the backwards b6 pawn is attacking, and the player which can first get to that file and take advantage of it is white, because both the rook and the queen can swing across. So where this brings us to now a critical thinking moment is we have to ask ourselves what to do in this position, and there are two fundamental ways of playing here. One idea is to play on the king side, another idea is to play on the queen side. And when creating a plan and trying to figure out which side of the board to play on, the first thing you need to do is dream up fantasy positions and then assess whether or not you'd be happy with those positions and how your opponent could respond. So the first thing to assess here is whether or not we can attack the black king. We've got the bishop on d5 pointing down towards it. We've got a space advantage here. We can quickly bring the queen into the king side. We can also bring the rook into the king side quite quickly. So if we put a fantasy position on the board here, where queen and rook were doubled and attacking the black king in front of white's own pawns, then the position might look something like this. So if we imagine that the position is exactly the same as it was before, but now our rook and queen have been transported from the squares they were on onto this g-file attacking the black king. There's now a threat to play rook g6, utilising the fact that the pawn on f7 is pinned to the king by the bishop on d5, and after the queen moves away, let's say to e7, we'd then be able to take the g7 pawn with our rook, and suddenly we're crashing through to the king, and that will be game over. However, the problem with all of this is that when we reach this position, black can simply respond by sidestepping with the king. Say the black king moved to h8, suddenly our threats have disappeared. we're not threatening to take the g7 pawn because it's adequately defended. We can't drop the rook into g6 anymore because the f7 pawn is no longer pinned. And as such, the only way we can really proceed in this position is to move our queen away to some part of the board and start looking for a plan in a different direction. And so for this reason, once we've dreamed up this fantasy position, we can quickly disregard it because we realise that even if we reach it, we won't actually be able to make further progress once black responds to the threat. So coming back here, it's important to consider how else we might be able to play on the king side. And the other key consideration here is what would happen if we were to start pawn storming the black king, throw in the g and the h pawn all the way down the board and looking to open the position and open attacking lines against the black king. So if we now imagine this fantasy position for a moment, we should again take stock of what's going on here to consider whether it's a good plan. Now this is definitely a good position for white and it is winning for white. However, is it the best plan? And that's a trickier question. So to reach this position takes some time because we'd have to maneuver our pieces in such a way that we can start advancing the pawns without actually allowing the black queen to take them. And all the while we'll be doing this, black will be looking to unravel his own position, which he may possibly have time to do if given the chance. The other thing we have to consider with a pawn storm is if it backfires, we leave our own king very exposed because of the fact that we're pushing forward all of the pawn cover in front of the king. So it's a very committal decision to start pushing pawns down the board. So there is an element of risk in this plan and there is an element of uncertainty. So it's one to bear in mind when going through this thinking process, but we don't necessarily want to commit to this until we've considered all possible plans. And so coming back to this position, having explored the possibilities of playing on the king side, we should now turn our attention to the queen side to understand what plan might exist there. There's an obvious target of attack here on b6, and we've instantly got two pieces that will be able to attack this pawn, the rook on f1 and the queen on c2. So again, it begs the question, what's the best way to attack this pawn? Now, the simplest way to attack this pawn is to move the rook to b1, the queen to b2, and suddenly they're both lined up attacking. But if we bear in mind that what we're trying to do here is create our ultimate fantasy positions, then we can probably do slightly better than that. For example, what if the position looked like this? Here we can see that white has achieved the same objective of attacking the pawn on b6 with two pieces, the queen and rook, but now the white queen is much more actively placed because not only is it attacking the pawn on b6 and also x-raying the pawn on c5, it's also looking at the pawn on f7, which is then tying down the black queen, and it also has the ability now to jump into this back rank and give checks potentially. In response to the positioning of the white pieces here, black would be forced to lift the rook onto d6 where it can then defend along the 6th rank. And so this is probably quite a likely position that would arise were white able to execute on the plan here. So having reached this fantasy position, we now have to compare it to the fantasy position we reached on the king side when we launched the pawn storm. The reality is both positions are very good, but the great thing about this position is we reached it with very little risk. We haven't had to push our kingside pawns, we haven't had to expose our king, and there's no risk of the pawn storm backfiring and then leaving our own monarch exposed. And so on balance of the two things, if we can reach this fantasy position, this is likely now the better plan because of the minimal risk involved. So now we have to ask ourselves, is it possible to reach this fantasy position? Coming back here, we can see that for the rook to reach b1 is very easy. It only takes one move. For the white queen to reach a7 takes two moves. It will need to come via a4 to a7. So if white is to now execute on this plan, it begs the question of which move should white play first, and figuring out which order these moves should be played in can actually be deduced quite quickly. And the reason being, if white were to play rook to b1, this would then allow black to play bishop to d7, preventing the white queen from coming into a4, and suddenly we're unable to execute on our desired plan. If, however, coming back here we first play queen to a4, now this plan can no longer be prevented. So in this game, which was Botvinnik versus Can, Leningrad 1939, Can now played bishop to d7, hitting the white queen. The queen now jumped into a7, continuing on the plan. Can dropped the bishop back to e8, defending this sensitive f7 point. Botvinnik continued with his plan of bringing the rook to the b file. Can was forced to defend with rook d6. And now a really lovely concept from Botvinnik he plays pawn to a4, looking to advance to a5 and attack the base of this pawn chain. Can is now a bit paralysed in this position, so he plays king to h7, essentially because he has barely any moves to actually play. Botvinnik continues with a5, and now Can really doesn't have anything better but pawn takes a5, and here Botvinnik plays queen takes a5. Note that he doesn't capture the pawn on c5 first, because then black would be able to advance this pawn to a4, at which point it's defended by the bishop on e8, and suddenly the game is very different. Can now plays rook to a6, hitting the queen, looking to activate, and Botvinnik jumps in and chops off the c5 pawn. So this game is a fantastic demonstration of the importance of looking to activate your bad bishop because of the opportunities it then presents to form plans around that. And it's also a great illustration of then how to form a plan around the trumps in your position in order to convert on your advantages. So I'll leave it there for this game. I do hope you got something useful out of this and it helps you in your own games. As always, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again in another video.